You're listening to Gender, a Wider Lens.
I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States. Since 2016, my practice has been exclusively dedicated to gender-questioning teens and families impacted by gender dysphoria.
I also work with gender-questioning teenagers, and I facilitated support meetings for families and individuals who've been impacted by gender issues.
We're curious about the concept of gender and how it's unfolding in the wider culture.
Join us as we look at gender through a wider lens.
Dr. Leonore Tiefer is a native New Yorker and an author, educator, feminist, researcher, psychologist, and activist whose work focuses on sexuality. She was a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the NYU School of Medicine from 1981 to 2018. She's been elected office and received honors from major U.S. and international sexology and feminist psychology organizations, such as the International Academy of Sex Research and the Association for Women in Psychology. Today, Leonore tells us about getting her PhD from UC Berkeley in 1969. As a sexologist, she was studying hormones and sexual behavior in rats. When she got wind of the women's revolution taking place right outside her lab, she began a deep dive into feminist readings. Thinking about the cultural and social aspects of sexuality completely changed her paradigm. She came to believe that observing rat behavior in a lab could never really help us understand how humans think about our own sexual experiences. So she changed the direction of her work completely and eventually directed the Campaign for a New View of Women's Sexual Problems, which meant to challenge sexual medicalization and Big Pharma trends. That was between 2000 and 2016. The New View was a grassroots campaign focused on so-called female sexual dysfunction and the growing industry of cosmetogynecology. In 2011, the award-winning documentary on this subject, called Orgasm Inc., featured Dr. Tiefer's work and tracked one drug company's race to develop the first female viagra. Leonore is also the author of hundreds of research and theoretical papers and book reviews, and she's also authored several books, including Sex is Not a Natural Act, which we talk about today. She's recently taken a keen interest in pediatric gender medicine, which of course has some familiar elements for Dr. Tiefer, namely that the financial interests of drug companies, overzealous physicians, well-meaning social justice elements, and eager patients themselves can create a perfect storm for ethically questionable medicine. You may notice that we actually had a hard time with Dr. Tiefer's internet connection, and our editing team did the best they could with our audio. Things do clear up towards the middle of the interview, though, so we hope it doesn't become too distracting. Dr. Tiefer's insights are really valuable. She was a wealth of knowledge, and she brings this very interesting human and yet analytical lens to the field of sexology. So we're actually hoping to have her back on since there was so much to discuss. Unfortunately, some really good bits of the interview had to get cut out altogether because of sound quality, but we really just kind of barely scratched the surface here. So hopefully this will be accompanied by another interview in the future. But for now, here's our first discussion with Dr. Leonore Tiefer. Hi, Stella.
Hi, Sasha. How are you?
I'm great.
We have the lovely Leonore Tiefer. Have I pronounced your name right, Leonore?
Tiefer.
Tiefer, Leonore Tiefer, who is a kind of a major presence for me anyway, in our understanding of so many elements of this gender issue in ways that I had never seen until I started hearing you speak, Leonore, and reading you. I realized, oh my God, there's so many dots to be joined. And I've really become really interested in your take on an awful lot of things to do with how we came to be here in 2022 and this whole gender. So where did it all begin, Leonore?
Well, you flatter me, Stella. I'll just return the flattery. I mean, I think you guys are doing amazing work and really making a difference. And I've listened to so many of these podcasts and learned a lot. So if I can add my 2 cents and anyone will benefit, that's a great thrill for me.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Leonore.
So, I mean, I'll just tell my story. I'll give you the abbreviated version. So I got my PhD in 1969 in Berkeley which was before the women's movement. And I was in the psychology department, and my major professor was Frank Beach. And I was doing my work on animal sexuality, hormones and animal sexuality. I did my dissertation on hamsters, but I know hamsters and I know rats. I never did any work with mice. But it was a pre-feminist time. So I, for example, was not hired to do any of the sex research. I wasn't paid. Only boys could do that in graduate school. So I go back a long, long way. So I get the PhD in animal sex research, and my thinking at the time is that we're building a big edifice of understanding sexuality. All the bricks are going to come together, and hamsters are a little brick, and my research is a little shred of the little brick. And that was my thinking. We're all part of the great animal kingdom, and somehow it's all going to fit together. I didn't know about, and really there wasn't much being talked about the history of sexology or, anything about politics at the time. It was science, science, science. So I get the PhD and I get a job and I have my own little laboratory and I'm doing research on rats and that's 1970, 71. And in 1972, I had, this epiphany, a true religious moment when I was the only woman in 27-person psychology department, and another woman joined the department. She came from Chicago. She was a lesbian, first lesbian I really had known. I mean, there I was with a PhD in psychology, and there I was so ignorant. So she says, Leonore, her name was Pam, Leonore, do you know there's a revolution going on out there? And I said, Pam, I'm very busy here. I have graduate students in a laboratory and a lot of classes to teach. Just kind of make it short and tell me about the revolution. So, it wasn't exactly overnight, but within, a few months, I had read these pamphlets, and these brochures, and I was, what can I say? The scales fell from my eyes. And I realized there was a word called sexism, and that it applied to so much of what I knew. So I became a feminist, and I taught psych of women, and I kind of recanted my dissertation, and I stopped doing animal research. I felt like there was no big picture anymore.
Can I ask, what were the concepts that you came across that created this scales falling from your eyes moment? And how was that contraindicated with your animal research? I'm just curious about, why did you feel like you had to make this huge pivot?
It didn't make sense to me anymore. I had undergone a paradigm shift, a personal paradigm shift, and the factors that I saw that were relevant to women's sexuality, since now I had somehow put women at the center of the analysis, something I had never thought of before, the factors were all social, cultural, and historical. And I felt, I could study rats until the end of time, and I would never understand anything about lingerie, or poetry, or any of the things that seemed to matter to women. And I wouldn't understand, obviously, about sexism and depression and internalized depression and so on. So it just didn't make any sense to be studying, the micro realities of hormones and prenatal injections in rats.
Wow. So keep going. You had this epiphany and the scales fell from your eyes.
Right. So then the question was, well, now I was about 32 years old, or was about 30 years old. And I thought, well, now what am I supposed to do with the rest of my life? I have a PhD. I have a whole bunch of publications, in animal sex research. I belong to these organizations. I subscribe to these journals. What am I supposed to do? And it was a crisis of the soul, right? Should I go to medical school? What should I do? And I decided, I was self-employed. It's not self-employed, but I had no additional money. I come from a relatively lower class background. I always knew I had to support myself. And so the idea of jettisoning, my entire PhD training, I just didn't make any sense. I didn't know where I'd get the money to go to medical school, and I didn't think I had the brains for organic chemistry. So I figured I'd stay in sexology, but I would move to human beings instead of animals. So I got retrained briefly, and then later on, I got a second graduate degree in clinical psychology. I moved over from the focus on animals to the focus on people.
Could I just ask, this move from the hamsters to the women, was it kind of like there was no depth or emotional kind of addition in the hamster, and you thought we're missing a huge amount on female sexuality? Is that what it was?
The emotion was part of it, but it was also the social rules, the social context. I thought women experience their sexuality because of their social context, how they were raised, their religion, their where are they living, their generation. Is it the 20th century or is it the 15th century?
Wow.
Am I Cleopatra, or what's going on here? So I I that was the part that was missing, the social science.
Oh, because human beings have culture and animals don't. So you studying rats in a lab doesn't tell us much about how human sexuality interacts with human culture.
Right. So I respecialized. I began to do sex therapy, which is how I made a living for the subsequent 30, 40 years. I taught medical students about human sexuality. I taught nursing students. And I got employed first in a department of psychiatry and then in departments of urology as a psychologist, doing interviews on patients with sexual dysfunctions. So I kind of moved into the area of specialization within sexology that I guess we'd call sexual dysfunction. But of course, I'm a feminist, right? And I'm belonging to all these feminist organizations, and I'm reading all these feminist articles and books and journals. And so I'm taking a very skeptical look at the whole area of diagnosis, um, of, I don't know, power relations within marriages that are creating sexual problems. Doctor-patient relationships. I'm embedded in all of this, but as a feminist, I'm like looking at it like an anthropologist. So, I became a little skitsy, I think, doing the work during the day and criticizing the work, at conferences and in my reading. So,
Where did you zero in? Yeah, keep going.
well, I'm just saying that kind of skepticism, of course, I'm a psychologist, Stella, so, you're a psychologist 24/7 if you're a psychologist, and you're a psychologist on yourself all the time. So, I have thought a lot about why being an insider outsider was a comfortable space for me. But it was. I don't need to unzip my entire personality here, but it was comfortable for me to be both a participant and an observer. And that's what I continued to do. And as the field, the industry, I will say, of sexual dysfunction uh, began to grow in the 90s, well, really in the 80s, and then in the 90s, and then with the approval of Viagra in 1998, it exploded into the public sphere. I found that by that time, I really had quite a massive understanding of this whole situation. And I also had this insider feeling, which gave me compassion for the patients, really compassion for the doctors and the providers also, but also a real skeptical outlook on the larger systems that were at work, having to do with the pharmaceutical industry, changes in the business of medicine, regulatory structures, government, and so on. So that's what I did. And, by the time Viagra was approved in 98, I'd been working in urology departments by that time, for 15 years. I had a lot of seniority in sexology. And so I decided that I would convene a critical organization. You guys know about critical organizations and their role. So I would convene this thing that I called a new view of women's sexuality, for lack of anything more interesting to call it, and that I would try to criticize the medicalization of sexual dysfunction, both as a scholar and as an activist. And I kept that up for a number of years until 2016, when I ended this campaign, this scholar activist. So the activities of the campaign were very varied. And the longer we were at it, the better we got at it. And in addition to our publications and street demonstrations and electronic stuff, we held conferences. NewViewCampaign.org tells the story.
Wow. And what was your main issue with the medicalization of sexual dysfunction?
The problem has to do with norms. Fundamentally, it has to do with norms, because the diagnostic nomenclature, the list of sexual dysfunctions, what is a sexual dysfunction? That's what we call diagnostic nomenclature. You have to have some idea of what's normal sexual function. So, what's in the diagnostic nomenclature? Orgasm problems, erection problems, ejaculation problems, desire problems, and the whole categorization, classification, which is a major activity in medicine, seemed, from a feminist point of view, to be not only wrong, but massively counterproductive. So that instead of facilitating a good, happy, robust sexual life for women, the idea that, well, no, there's a normal way to do it and a normal amount of it to have, that seemed counterproductive. So the challenge of was to undermine, really, this whole medicalization. You don't have a problem. You don't need drugs. You need education, self-education, public education. So that was the perspective.
I remember when I was I think I must have been an undergraduate psychology student at the time. And I remember learning, this may not have even been in school, I might have just learned it somewhere else, but I remember learning that most women do not have vaginal orgasms, and that most women experience clitoral orgasms much more readily. And I remember feeling like that was such a revelation, because my whole conception of what I thought sex was supposed to be And I was a really late bloomer, so I hadn't even had sex at this point. But I remember my whole concept was that two people are supposed to have penetrative sex, and then both people are supposed to have an orgasm. And I suspected that this wouldn't necessarily be the case for myself. And I thought, okay, and maybe I'm just this one bizarre oddball person that doesn't think this is going to work for me. So I think this whole idea of questioning what are the norms and what is considered normal sex, and even how much sex you're supposed to have, this is really important. And so within the diagnostic criteria that you were looking at the time for sexual dysfunction, you realized that there was a gap between what this diagnosis says and what most normal human relationships are like, or where did you piece it together? Was it mostly from your feminist studies, or was it also based on just knowing women and experience and all of it put together?
Now, this is where you and I look at the world differently, because that's a very clinical question. And it's a sort of humanistic question. Where did you get these ideas from, knowing women? And in fact, I come at this much more as an intellectual. And my sense was that this was a structural problem, that these diagnoses were coming from a false understanding of research and history. And there were plenty of people, Sasha, who were doing research on real women and real women's real orgasms or non-orgasms or clitorises or experiences or whatever. I felt I didn't need to do that. What I felt I was good at was saying, the emperor has no clothes here. This whole system was created falsely, and going back into the literature, trying to find the basis of the diagnostic nomenclature, and in fact showing that it was
invalid.
This
kind of sounds like Bob Ostertag's position as well, which is, I don't know if I'm right, Leonore, but there's a postmodern flair in this, which is where do we actually get these ideas in the first place? There is no solid ground on which to base these ideas. Who decides what's normal? Those ideas do come from a kind of postmodern place where some feminist analysis comes from, right? And
I was certainly swimming in that water in the 90s. I don't feel a kinship with the postmodern position that there's no truth, no objectivity, no solid ground. The critique of science has been going on now for several decades, and to lump it all under postmodernism is to give, I think, too much credit to the perspective that really annihilates all of science. And that says it's all language, there's no reality out there. Science is a waste of time. I don't come from that at all.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high quality content for this show, and we're grateful to Rhyme and GenSpect for supporting us.
Rhyme, or Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics, is a non-profit organisation dedicated to improving long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
And GenSpect is an international alliance of parents and professional groups whose aim is to advocate for parents of gender-questioning children and young people.
If you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts and special Q&As, and you can join our listener community.
Now back to the show. Okay, so then, Leonore, you were featured in a really interesting film called Orgasm Inc. Tell us about that.
This was amazing. It taught me so much, really. Liz Canner had gotten a kind of freelance job making erotic films to be used by a small pharmaceutical startup that was making a drug that was supposed to help women's sexuality. And as she was more and more involved in this company, she realized that this entire thing had a lot of problems. It was not really a very feminist endeavor. So she started looking around, and she found her way to me, since I was kind of the chief critic of this pharmaceutical tsunami that was coming at sexuality. And she followed me around for several years and filmed speeches and lectures, rallies, fundraisers, a lot of fundraisers. And the climax of Orgasm Inc. took place at the Food and Drug Administration hearing that was evaluating the first drug. Well, not really the first drug. The first drug kind of went down the tubes without a hearing. But the second drug that was being considered for female sexual dysfunction, particularly for desire problems, a central nervous system drug named flibanserin. And she filmed that hearing, and it was a remarkably dramatic situation. They ultimately voted against the drug. That was in 2010. Her film comes out in 2011. And it's a kind of milestone in the history of this medicalization of female sexuality. But of course, what happened? In 2015, that drug was in fact approved by the FDA. And I mean, there are so many strands to this story, the regulatory system and so on. But it seems that changes have occurred over the last 10 or 20 years that the federal government calls patient friendly. We might call insufficient regulation. And as a consequence, a lot of lobbying by the manufacturers of this drug argued, wait a minute, men have drugs, women should have drugs too. It's gender inequity. So all of a sudden, the politics of gender, I mean, does that ring a bell, ladies? The politics of gender interfered with what was supposed to be an objective scientific situation. So the quality of the drug had not improved. It hadn't helped any more women have any satisfactory lives. What they did was change the endpoints, right? They fiddled around with the qualifications to get a drug approved, and that's symptomatic of so many things that are going on in the wider world. So the very drug that Liz Canner's film celebrates going down the tubes is now alive and well and available for your doctor to write a prescription.
So, Leonore, what was this drug supposed to be able to do for women who took it?
It was being trialed. It was being tested for low sexual desire, inhibited sexual desire. And the idea would be you had to take it daily, indefinitely. This is a central nervous system drug. It actually had failed as a antidepressant, and they brought it back. They didn't really know how it worked. Presumably, it affected serotonin, norepinephrine, neurotransmitters in the brain, but nobody really knows how sexual desire works in the brain. So it was supposed to help women have more sexual desire, but what does that even mean? I mean, more sexual desire randomly, spontaneously for the mailman, or more sexual desire for your beloved person whom you're angry with because he's not taking out the garbage, or I don't know. So the whole idea of, how you measure this, so they would measure it by number of sexual encounters. But, what is that? For one person, a sexual encounter would be, a loving feeling, an embrace, a kiss. For another person, it's the whole enchilada. So, I mean, the whole measurement thing is so confusing and so difficult in the area of sexology and sexual dysfunction.
And is your thesis that we have just tried to medicalize our sexual lives when actually we needed to have a deeper understanding of the female, especially the female sexuality?
Yeah, that is, in a nutshell, that is it. And I wouldn't say especially for women. I just think people don't have any understanding of sexuality because for centuries it was regulated and repressed by religion. And you were told you got married and then you did it and you had children, and everything else was kind of illegal or immoral or irrational, and nobody understood it. And so now all of a sudden, the restrictions have subsided, but we're in a new era without adequate education. So I feel like the loss of religion was kind of replaced by the health metaphor, the medicalization area, and all sorts of so-called experts and profit-seeking companies rushed in to solve the problem of the people who don't really know much about this. They're going on a kind of idea that it's natural. Well, it should just happen. But it doesn't just happen when the stakes are so high, the expectations are so high, and the preparation is so inadequate.
Can I ask a question? I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about evolutionary biology, and you touched on this very briefly about like this mammalian thing. I think I heard you in an interview talking about this, that we assume sex is just this mammalian behavior that is intrinsic and natural. And I think you're saying that actually it's not. But when I think about animal behavior around sex, it's not always, I mean, it's not always ideal. It seems to be often with a lot of conflict between the male and female participant in the sex act. Sometimes there's really ugly behavior like coercion or, like sex in nature is nothing like what we maybe imagine ideal sex to be as a human. I'm wondering, like, where do we make sense of that? Do you hear my question? Like, I'm not articulating it very well, but as a human being, we do maybe have like this fantasy idea of what we want sexuality to be, and is it realistic?
Well, I don't know who this we is. I think human beings have expectations about sexuality based on their culture, their religion, the time and place that they're living in. And, some people have a very romantic notion, some people have a very pragmatic notion, some people have a very, I don't know, there's all kinds of ways that people can construe sexuality. Is it supposed to be primarily about love, or is it primarily about intense pleasure and sensation, or is it just a means to an end in terms of reproduction? I mean, people are so different.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you, after 30 years as a sex therapist, I can tell you that how people feel about being touched, being kissed, about arousal. I mean, it's just enormously varied, and all of that was in New York. So, and I haven't even, treated people in Morocco or.
Yeah. I got interested too. You talked about being a sex therapist for, I think you said 30 or 40 years, and teaching medical students and nursing students. Have you been keeping up with the type of curricula that are being used in programs for sex therapy these days? Are you familiar with the influx of some queer theory and the sex positivity movement? I'm just curious if you could comment on what you've seen change in your field and what do you think about it?
Well, I think that it's been taken over by the discourse of consent, that there's a great deal of concern about consent and um, abuse nowadays that was not present when I was doing the teaching. I think, in terms of arousal and enjoyment and performance and expectations, that really hasn't changed. It wasn't very well known, and there were a few theories and principles, but the whole addition now, I don't know is how I would say that queer theory has gotten involved, because that's really about gender rather than sexual relations. I don't think that that's been the problem. The problem, I think, has been hyper concern with consent.
How would you like it to go? I can hear there's a lot of criticism, and I find it very interesting. And yet, a part of me thinks surely the likes of Viagra has really helped millions of people. So I am interested in your thoughts on that, because I anticipate you might say, yet it brought other issues. And then, secondly, I'd love to know, where do you think we should have gone, and where could we go in our understanding of sex?
Well, we don't really know the impact of Viagra. We know the public relations wing of the pharmaceutical industry, Pfizer in particular, that manufactures this drug, and now there are several other similar drugs. They make all kinds of claims, but you would be astonished at the paucity of research on the impact of something that is supposed to be so enormously culture changing. I even tried to do some research. I tried to find subjects who had taken Viagra or were taking Viagra that I could interview. How do you go about doing that? I mean, this was kind of in the internet era, and I don't really have a lot of confidence in internet research, but that's sort of the way things are going. But it's really hard to find subjects for sex research. So I don't actually know if it's helped a lot of people. I'm sure that it's like this. The research now, you look at the discontinuation of prescriptions, and so many prescriptions for Viagra are not refilled. And we also know that there are unintended side effects to the taking of Viagra in terms of genital consequences and so on. I won't deviate off into that. So I don't know if it's been a great boon for humankind or not.
And could you tell me about your concept around
Yes.
disease
Yeah.
mongering?
Well, I'll
And
get that, but let me answer your second
okay,
question,
yeah.
Stella, about what would I like to see. Um, I really go with this very old fashioned and trite idea that sex is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. But I mean really biopsychosocial, like at every exact second the bio, the psycho, and the social are interacting. And I feel that that model needs to be taught more. For example, the effects of conditioning, expectation on arousal, on sensation. People don't do any research on that. So I would get patients all the time who didn't like kissing. Well, why don't I like kissing? Everyone is supposed to like kissing. And I would say, well, there's nothing natural about kissing. Kissing is a learned activity, and it involves being touched, and involves another face being close to you, and it involves toleration of lots of things. Let's break it down. And people would start crying and say, but they're kissing in the movies. It's all natural. What's the matter with me? That's the problem, Stella, is people don't realize the complexity of the psycho, the bio, and the social.
Wow.
I think that's a really good point. I've often wondered, like, who invented this maneuver where, like, two people put their hot funky mouths together and like put their tongues in each other's mouths. Like, I mean, maybe this is a post-COVID realization, but I'm like, there is something a little icky about it. So I think it's just funny. But I'm also thinking about, I think it was maybe a book by Esther Perel or something that I read about just that sensuality and intimacy is so much more than just like the act where two bodies come together. It is, I think she refers to like the entire process of like the anticipation leading up to the date or the encounter or the thinking about the other person or like figuring out what you're going to wear. Like there's so much broader of a view we can take around what intimacy means, what is sexuality, and we tend to look at it in this very mechanistic way, like it is the act of this organ and that organ coming together. But I mean, what you're talking about, Leonore, almost reminds me of how we think about gender exploratory therapy, that we look at the person as a whole person in a context and trying to understand how did this distress around their gender, for example, arise, and using the biopsychosocial model. So I think we need to, I think what you're saying is we need to look at sexuality in the same way and like reconnect it to all of the complicated human aspects of how we interact with the world around us, with people in our lives, with ourselves, with our bodies, with our desires, with our sensations. Like there's much more to it than just having an orgasm, which is, where do you think that idea came from? Like, why do you think has there ever been a time, or has there ever been a place where sexuality you think is given its proper contextual due?
Sexuality continually changes because the culture continually changes. Certainly nowadays, with the decline of laws against censorship, with the rise of the internet, the water we swim in has completely changed. So sexuality has changed. Expectation, I agree. Expectation is one of the most important elements. And the assumptions that people make that sex is a natural act. I wrote this book called Sex is Not a Natural Act because that was the major insight that I felt I had, that this is not dictated by instinct or anything like that, that this is a complicated interaction of the psychological, the social, and so on. And I think the trouble with the gender angle now is the politics have become so intense and so um, intrusive that it's impossible almost to step back and try to take any sort of intellectual perspective on this topic. And I'm fortunate that I spent all of these years trying to unpack sexuality and realizing how complicated it was so that I can now import that insight into this other field. Otherwise, it's really hard when people are shooting at you from all sides to take a intellectual, dispassionate perspective.
How did you get interested in gender, and like how did this come across your radar, and what parallels do you see?
Well, the field of sexology that I was in during the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on was included the discussion of gender dysphoria and transsexualism and intersexuality. And that was part of it. It was just a very small, vanishingly small area because there were so few patients and there were so few researchers. And it was so at the International Academy of Sex Research that I belonged to for so many years, where I met all these people that you've been interviewing or been hearing about, there were always panels and papers on transsexualism. And I even uh, published a couple of papers myself following up post operative patients because I was working in a urology department. And that's what we did. But we're talking, few and far between. So when I was working in that field, I co-directed a clinic for the study of sex and gender, because they just went together like, peanut butter and jelly at the time.
I'm trying to think now how to kind of bring in the point that you had made earlier, which I'm dying to ask you about, which is how that you were at the conference where they changed the name from the Harry Benjamin Gender Dysphoria International Association to WPATH. I think that was around about 2006 or so.
No, actually,
2008.
I think it might have been 1979.
Well, that was when it was formed. That was when the Harry Benjamin
Yes,
Association was formed.
that's right.
Were
No,
you at that?
I was at that one. I was not there where they changed it to WPATH, because that was a whole nother generation of people who had a whole different agenda and were coming already from the international classification systems and WHO, and they were on a mission to create a field of sexual health and a whole language of sexual health that would be, I don't know, would be destigmatized. The goal was to destigmatize everything. That was kind of long after my time. I was in the stigmatized time where, you had a problem, we called it a problem. And I was a licensed treater of problems, and people came to me to get treatment for their problems. I didn't feel they were stigmatized. They didn't feel they were stigmatized. It was a whole different ball game. But the WPATH thinking, the anti-stigmatization thinking, that all came out of kind of the gay and lesbian rights movement, and, as it were, infiltrated sexology. So back in 79, at the formation of the HABIGDA, as we called it, the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, there were a small number of people, and a small number of patients, and a small number of professionals.
And were there what we might call activists? Were there any activists then, or was it more delineated?
There were no activists then, and back at that time, there were no gender dysphoric participants. There were no professionals who themselves self-defined as transsexual. I mean, the word transgender didn't even exist back then. There were certainly, out in the real world, where sexuality lives out in the world, there were plenty of people who were actively involved in, let's say, cross-dressing associations, um, magazines, fairs, and there would be occasional visitors from that real world, just like there would be visitors from the world of prostitution and pornography to speak to sexologists. But this was not regarded. I mean, we were there to do science. And so to involve the kind of commercial, popular world of cross dressers was not really on the radar back at the time. And the activists, I hate to tell you, I was one of the activists, because feminism was the activism at the time. What about women? Remember women, don't forget women, think about women. That was the activism at the time.
When we got on the call before we started recording, you said, I have been mired in these issues for a really long time, and they just keep popping up in different ways. And obviously you've been doing this work for decades. Do you think that we will ever take an appropriate look at the role over medicalization and like what you call disease mongering? Do you think there will ever be a time where we're able to look with a little more clarity and, I guess, humanity at these questions? Or do you think we're doomed to repeat this pattern forever?
Well, I think medicalization is a huge social trend that has both profitability aspects that go on because everybody wants to make a buck, and you can always figure out a new way to make a buck. And sex is a very profitable area. So, medicalizing sex because of the profitability angle, that's going to go on and on. But the irony, and I have to say this is a great irony, has to do with the political input, that there are now political forces that are in favor of medicalizing as well, and they change. I mean, the players change all the time. So the forces now that want insurance coverage, let's say, for all sorts of medical procedures that we at one point might have called elective, might have called cosmetic, now they're regarded as medically necessary. So that's a form of medicalization. The insurance industry, along with the pharmaceutical industry, is a big player. I mean, really big, bigger than the fingers on all of our hands and feet multiplied. They are on the job all the time, enlarging their world. So until, we get the money out of the thing, and until we get the politics out of the thing, I don't think that we can anticipate any sort of, clear-eyed view. Medicalization is just huge, and it's been promoted by many people for many good purposes. I mean, the world has less disease and pain and suffering in it than it did before we had medicine, right? People are living longer, and they're living better, and things are getting treated. There's no question about it. So, the growth of medicine is a great thing. But like so many things, it gets corrupted, or it gets, you know,
Commercialized.
yeah, commercialized. It's overwhelmed by forces, so that in order to make medicines now, you have to deal with an industry that is gigantic, hyper gigantic, and has forces of persuasion at its beck and call that influence people. We have direct to consumer advertising. You don't have that over in Ireland, Stella, but in the United States and in New Zealand, the only two places on earth where we have direct to consumer advertising, our airwaves are filled 24/7 with commercial promotions for medicines, for surgeries, for all kinds of ways to improve yourself. So, I mean, people want to improve themselves. And we have, of course, now the internet, which tells you you're no good and you're ugly. And so you even want to improve yourself. And we can go in that direction. But the answer is no, we're not going to escape medicalization as long as the forces promoting it are so powerful and have so much incentive.
And if you look at yourself and you're talking about the medicalization of sex, and then it moved into the medicalization of gender, did you watch that and almost see it coming because you were so immersed in the medicalization of sex?
The answer is no. You know what I did observe was the commercialization of, what can I call it, of imagery, of sexually. I mean, sex is. I read the New York Times every day, whether that's good for me or not, I don't know. But the newspapers, magazines, over the course of the '90s and then the aughts, and then of course the teens, they just got full of fashion and makeup and celebrity and television and movies, all of which celebrated something other than heteronormativity, God forbid. And they did that, of course, because it was new and it was different. But at a certain point, it became a drumbeat that was weird. And that's what I noticed. You couldn't open the New York Times without there being a layout on boys wearing dresses, boys wearing makeup, girls with shaved heads, tragic stories, celebratory stories, whatever. That's what I noticed first was the media mania about portraying something other than heteronormativity.
I thought you were going to say when you were talking there about the newspapers, I thought you were going to bring in, and I was nodding vigorously, thinking you were going to bring in that there was an emphasis on looks and on vanity and the you swerve left into was actually all about anti-heteronormativity. And I would have thought there was just an extraordinary emphasis, maybe I'm wrong, but on looks and branding and people branding, if you follow me, and how beautiful they were. From the 90s onwards, I just not convinced it was there as much before. I thought newspapers were newspapers, and then they turned into these pseudo
Yes.
magazines.
I think you have a truth there, Stella, that news became entertainment, and we can certainly track that in the 80s and the 90s when it was just there was too much competition, and so they had to get into more popular topics. But wanting to look good and comparing yourself to other people. I mean, New York is a fashion capital of the planet here. Certainly, we were never free for a minute of what's the color for spring, and what's the skirt length for fall, and the newspapers were always full of that, but they were kind of like conventional, and you focused on the material and the colors. All of a sudden, Shazam, you focused on weird, the weirder the better.
It's been really interesting to think about how all of these things relate to one another, and I think touching on the way consumerism also changes and how we can be marketed different things at different times. I think that's what's so valuable about your perspective, and I know Stella, you emphasize this a lot too. Like, what about the historical context at this moment in time? What does it mean? And it's really interesting to think about how there are different meanings in what we believe is valuable and worth buying into. So, Leonore, is there anywhere you'd like our audience to go to check out more about your work or look at some of the projects you've been involved in?
Well, the entire medicalization of sexual dysfunction story is on the website newviewcampaign.org, which is now kind of an archive, a frozen archive of everything that we did in terms of media and video and conference programs and publications. And I like to think that it's a kind of example of scholar activism where you have a group of people who have both professional and intellectual training and interests, but who also want to make a difference in the public discourse. So that's where I would send people. People could read Sex is Not a Natural Act. I do think that consumerism is a key element, and the way that we are manipulated by capitalism to want certain things in life that we think are somehow natural and God given. And you need history to understand how people didn't used to want these things. And are we really better off now? That's the question.
Whoa. Thanks a million, Leonore. That was fascinating, really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. This podcast is sponsored by Rhyme and GenSpect, and listener support means a lot to us. The best way to help is to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Follow us on social media, and if you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts of the show, special Q&As, and you can join our listener community. Just go to our Linktree. That's linktr.ee/widerlenspod.
Our discussions are for educational purposes only and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.